I went out of the court. They're all just pushing. They're all kind of like pushing you against the wall. And I was getting closer and closer to the wall.
I went out of the court. They're all just pushing. They're all kind of like pushing you against the wall. And I was getting closer and closer to the wall. I was like she was 20 years old, backed into a corner and screaming for her life. Not on a tennis court, but on a walkway outside, one surrounded by hundreds of people who loved her so much they nearly crushed her. That is where this story begins, not with a trophy, not with a ranking, not with some highlight. Real winner down the line. It begins with a wall, a concrete wall at the National Tennis Centre in Melbourne. Music and a young woman pressing her shoulder blades against it while a crowd surged forward with no idea what they were doing to her. Alex had just finished a practice session at the 2026 Australian Open. Routine stuff. Warm up, hit, pack your bag, head out, except nothing about Alex's life is routine anymore, even if the systems built around her haven't figured that out yet. She stepped off the court and into what can only be described as a human tide. Fans who had been waiting not for her match, for her practice, pushed forward all at once. Signatures, photos, gifts, hands reaching out. The ones at the front could see her face, the ones behind them couldn't see anything. So they music just kept pushing, and Alex, with her father nearby and her coach somewhere in the crowd, had nowhere to go except backward into concrete, inch by inch, until she realized this wasn't just chaotic, it was dangerous. She did the only thing she could do. She raised her voice and begged for space. Music, give me some space, or I'm going to get run over. That sentence should not be something a 20-year-old tennis player has to shout at a practice session. Music, and the fact that she did, tells you everything you need to know about where Alex is right now and how completely unprepared the world around her is for what she's become. See music, hair race, the thing that makes this more than just a scary moment at a tournament. Alex wasn't even inside the top 30 at the time. She was ranked in the 40s, and in professional tennis, your ranking determines almost everything. The courts you practice on, the security detail you're given, the infrastructure the tour wraps around you. If you're Iga Swiatek or Aina Sabalenka, you walk off a practice court, and there are people whose entire job is to manage exactly that transition. If you're ranked 45th, you're largely on your own. You get the standard package, and the standard package was not built for someone who draws the kind of crowds that Alex draws. That's the core of this whole story. Music, the infrastructure hasn't caught up to the reality. The system still looks at a number next to her name and makes decisions based on that. But the fans don't care about the number. They never did. They show up in Melbourne wearing Filipino flags. They show up in Dubai. And if you don't know this, the Middle East has one of the largest Filipino diaspora populations in the world, something most tennis fans had no idea about until Alex started playing there, and the stadium started shaking. They show up in New York, where Alex herself said the crowd energy hit different, like the city understood what was at stake. These aren't just tennis fans cheering for a good backhand. These are people who flew 12 hours to see someone who looks like them, who carries their culture onto a court that was never designed to hold that kind of emotional weight. Alex said it herself on the Players Box podcast. This is actually where the Melbourne story came out publicly. Weeks after it happened, she was sitting with 4 of the most experienced women on the WD Tour, players who have collectively seen everything the sport has to offer, and she described walking into that crowd after practice and feeling it close around her. Music, she talked about the wall getting closer. She talked about realizing mid-moment that this wasn't manageable anymore. And then she admitted something that says a lot about who she is. Her first instinct wasn't to demand protection. Music, her first instinct was to resist feeling like she needed it. She actually said she didn't want to feel like her head was getting too big, like asking for security was somehow a statement about ego rather than safety. Music, that's a 20-year-old trying to stay humble in a situation that would make most veterans reach for a bodyguard immediately. Music, but hair race, where the podcast moment gets genuinely powerful. Desiree Krushik, who has been on tour for years and has seen every level of this sport up close, heard Alex described that wall, and her response was immediate and completely unambiguous. You can ask for security. She said, just ask. That's it. Not a lecture, not a long conversation about brand management or image, just a peer, a fellow professional cutting through Alex's hesitation and saying the obvious thing out loud. And Alex listened. She requested security. For her next practice, Music got moved to a main court, and Kouchik's reaction afterward was 3 words that landed harder than any statistic could. You're crazy big here. Think about that for a second. This wasn't a fan account going viral. This wasn't a commentator reaching for a hot take. Music, this was someone who lives inside the tour ecosystem, who practices next to these players, who knows the difference between real star power and manufacture hype. And she looked at Alex and said, you're crazy big here. That's the moment the conversation stopped being subjective. And it wasn't just Krushik. Jessica Pagula, who was sitting right there on that podcast, World number 5 At the time, music brought up something that happened in Dubai that still seems almost surreal. Her coach was in the hotel. Music heard crowd noise coming from outside, turned to her and asked, "What's going on out there?" Music. The answer was Alex. Match not from inside the stadium, from a hotel room. The noise from one of Alex's matches was bleeding through windows and walls into a building across the way, and a top 5 players coach had no idea who was causing it. That's not a normal occurrence in women's tennis music. That's something else entirely. And what makes Alex so fascinating beyond the crowds, beyond the noise, beyond the wall in Melbourne is how she responds to all of it. She doesn't retreat. That's the detail that keeps coming up when you trace her story across tournaments. Music in Miami during the Open there this year, she was given security, proper security, a barrier between her and the crowd, and she walked past it not because she was being reckless, but because she looked at the people on the other side, saw the flags, understood what it cost some of them to be standing in that spot, and decided the barrier wasn't the right answer in that moment. She went to the music. That's not brand management. That's not a PR move someone cooked up in a boardroom. That's a young woman who genuinely understands that the people waving those flags aren't just fans, they're family, in a way that goes beyond any normal athlete-audience relationship. They're people who grew up the same way she did, who carry the same identity, who see themselves in her every time she walks onto a court. Music you can't manufacture, that you can't replicate it. It either exists or it doesn't. And with Alex, it exists at a level the WT has genuinely never had to deal with before from someone at her ranking. Now the clay season is here, and with it comes a whole new set of questions. Stuttgart, Madrid, music, Rome, Roland Garros, these are the next chapters. And every one of those tournaments is going to face the same test Melbourne faced. Is the setup ready for what Alex generates? Are the barriers in place? Is there someone at the tournament level thinking proactively about what happens when a 20-year-old with a ranking in the 40s walks off a practice court and into 1,000 people who have been waiting 3 hours just to breathe the same air as her? Because Melbourne showed us what happens when the answer is no. Music. One more thing about that Australian Open. Alex lost her first round match, lost it, clearly walked off that main court having gone out in the opening round of a Grand Slam, and then she walked into a crowd that didn't move. The fans were still there, music, the flags were still there. Nobody was packing up and heading for the exits because the match was over, and she lost. That almost never happens in tennis, in most sports. Honestly, music, the love that met her after that loss was completely disconnected from the result, and she admitted on the podcast that it messed with her emotionally in a way she hadn't expected. She was grieving the match on the inside while being embraced on the outside, and those two things colliding was genuinely hard to process. Music. But what did she do? She went to Indian Wells and beat Coco Gauff, one of the biggest names in the sport right now. She went to Miami and kept winning. She didn't let the Grand Slam exit become the story. She let the next court become the story. That's who Alex is. Music. That's the pattern. Seebeck then responds. Lost, then the crowd, the next morning, wall in Melbourne, security in the next city, viral moment in Miami, where she crossed the barrier herself because she decided connection mattered more than protocol. This is a player rewriting what it means to be a superstar in women's tennis in real time, and she's doing it at 45 in the rankings with a fan base that makes noise you can hear from hotel rooms. Music. The sport is going to have to keep up, the infrastructure is going to have to keep up, and if you've been watching this build through the early matches, through the flag waving in foreign stadiums, music, through the podcast confessions, and the Miami moments, then you already know what the tennis world is only now starting to figure out. Alex isn't just playing tennis, she's carrying something bigger than herself onto every court she steps on, and the sport is going to need bigger walls to hold